Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class on Wednesday, September 30th. And what I wanted to do was to talk about Dracula because last class you were left with the film Dracula. Again, I encourage you to read the responses from your classmates because that'll give you a sense of the kind of class discussion that we would have had if we were meeting in person. And just about universally, you had indicated that you thought that Dracula does deserve the kind of accolades that it's received in the past. And certainly it's a dated film in relation to what we would expect with modern cinema. But it's an incredibly important film, so much so that it's even been categorized as the first American horror film. You'll remember we talked about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being usually categorized by critics as the first horror film, but that was a German film, and that I wanted to focus on the American tradition of horror, though certainly we could focus on other cultures as well. And that would mean that we focus on Dracula. And Dracula was based on a novel by Bram Stoker. And if you know anything at all about that particular novel and how it came about, you might have heard a little bit about a night of ghost telling competition. And this was a night where several individuals, including Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet, and Mary Shelley, his wife, in addition to others, were on holiday and were experiencing some rainy weather, and they had to remain indoors. So they challenged each other to ghostwriting competition. And the result of that was that Mary Shelley ended up writing Frankenstein, one of the most famous Gothic texts that exists. But that night there was also a Dr. Polidori who wrote a short story called The Vampire. And it's believed that that short story helped to inspire Bram Stoker and his novel Dracula. And in a very clever decision-making process, he decided to call his vampire Dracula after Dracul, the son of the devil, based on a cruel Romanian conqueror who actually would impale his victims on stakes. So that said, Dracula, as you know, and many of you indicated, has just captured the American imagination in a way that perhaps no other horror figure has. You can definitely assume that you will find a few Draculas at your typical Halloween party. The first screen adaptation of Dracula was Nosferatu, and that was done in 1921, and that was a German expressionistic film done in the vein of something like Dr. Caligari. It's a beautifully shot film in terms of its shadows and its elongated images. It was a bootleg version of Dracula. At that point, Bram Stoker was dead, and Stoker's wife never released permission for this particular version of Dracula. So she wasn't compensated for it. She did everything within her power to destroy all of the prints that existed or to have them destroyed, and she was almost successful. Luckily for us, cinema buffs, she was not, because now we have Nosferatu to be able to view and watch. And we could have easily seen Nosferatu instead of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but I didn't necessarily see why we would want to focus on two vampire films at the beginning of the semester. And certainly The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, from an artistic perspective, is usually considered the first horror film. So I thought that would be a good way to start the class, even though it's not necessarily an American film. And Dracula started as a Broadway stage play, and many of the conventions that we've become accustomed to in film, such as the attire of the vampire, originated from that stage play. So, for instance, the collar, for instance, it was essential in terms of stage trickery, because there would be a trapdoor on the stage, and then when the vampire basically needed to disappear, what would happen is that the trapdoor would open and the costume was arranged in such a way so that it would remain standing with the collar up while the actor descended down into the stage, so that it appeared that basically it disappeared. And that's become part of the iconic costume of Bela Lugosi, who, when he was offered this role, did not speak English. He learned the role phonetically, and perhaps that's one of the reasons for his stalled and stilted delivery, which again has become iconic when we think about the vampire. The text is different than the film. So the text is something that I talk about in my Gothic literature class. It's not too surprising when the text deviates from the film. One of the reasons why is because the text is rather long. Bram Stoker's novel is several hundred pages long and is told in the epistolary novel technique, in other words, through letters. And this can oftentimes be and scrapbook clippings, newspaper articles, things of that nature. And this can oftentimes be difficult to translate over into film. And then, of course, you've got the limitations of time. So basically, the film, the 1931 iconic film, collapses much of the text plot and many of the characters as well. So that said, Dracula originally had no soundtrack, and that would have been the version that I would have given as our link. However, and that's what I did last semester. However, there is the issue of copyright, and there is the issue of things being removed from the internet, which I found to my horror that link was no longer active. So I was able to find another link, but it did include a musical score that was added on after the fact. And many of you indicated that the musical score helped to establish mood. And that's one of the things we will talk about, the importance of score. But watching the film with just sound effects and minimal music is an eerie experience in and of itself. That I can definitely guarantee. So, in terms of thinking about some of the symbolism involved in the film, I don't know if you noticed the medallion that the Bela Lugosi vampire character was wearing. There's been a good amount of scholarship that's been done to suggest that that medallion is supposed to be somewhat reminiscent of the Star of David. And if so, the assumption that Dracula in one way or another has Jewish characteristics. We do know that Dracula is considered to be other or outsider. And that's usually one of the ways the film is read, is about evil foreigner that happens to be invading or conquering civilized European worlds. And in other words, reverse imperialism. But if you wanted to think of Dracula or any movie monster basically representing any disenfranchised group, then you could certainly think about that medallion as perhaps suggestive of a religious affiliation. That said, this is an incredibly Christian text with lots of Christian imagery. I don't know if you notice some of the Christian imagery, for instance, in Dracula's castle, where the table is set up to look almost like an altar in a church with a chalice, for instance. So the film definitely deserves a second or a third viewing to appreciate some of the visual aspects of that. You may or may not have noticed there was an armadillo that was running around in that film. There is no good reason for that armadillo except that Todd Browning, the director, was fond of armadillos. So I guess when you're the director, you can do what it is you want to do. The sets obviously are very Gothic, very church-like in many respects, very cathedral-like when we see some of the sets of the castles. We had talked about the Gothic tradition as well, helping to inform horror film. And there was also a good amount of surprising censorship in a time where these films were pre-code. The assumption was that monsters and evil had to be destroyed at the end. That was a requirement. And also the death groans were censored out from Dracula, saying that they were just too realistic or too horrific. Or perhaps too suggestive, because one of the things that Dracula is well known for is its use of sexuality. And you can definitely see that in the text, but also in the movie version as well. And there is a long tradition of Dracula being portrayed as the seducer, and this idea of how he goes about transforming his victims through penetration, through teeth rather than through phallus. But nevertheless, there is enough sexual imagery there, even in the way that one would destroy the vampire with a stake, which is also some more phallic imagery, and those death groans perhaps being suggestive of sexual ecstasy with the penetration of a phallic-like object. And that's probably why the censors wanted those groans removed, more than them seeming to be too violent. Dracula is an interesting figure in that he is definitely a victimizer, and he's definitely considered the other and the monstrosity and evil. but he also is considered the victim as well. We as film viewers usually end up empathizing on some level. We admire so much that we end up taking costumes during parties to play this character. At one point, the character of Dracula says how lovely it would be to be dead. The idea of what happens after life, and is death really the worst thing that can happen to someone? Or Stephen King put, sometimes dead is better. And that was his reflections in Pet Sematary. But in relation to some of the symbolism that you could get from Dracula, probably the most common symbol, especially because the film, even though the text was done in the 1800s, the film was done in 1931, is about a blood-sucking capitalist. And that we've got someone of a superior class, a foreigner no less, who basically is taking the life force away from the masses. And if you think about the economic pain that moviegoers were experiencing, and that's part of the reasons why they would go to see films like Dracula, there was a certain level of escapism that was involved. But the image of the idea of the blood-sucking capitalist, which we could even use in today's world, about the idea of the uber rich, the 1%, living off of the labors of the 99%, or the laborer, works very nicely, I suppose, in terms of this film. Notice that the only time that there's real concern about Dracula's attacks is when he begins attacking women of upper classes. He initially attacks a flower girl, and there really isn't very much concern. It's only when the women of the appropriate class seem to be at risk that this propels Van Helsing and others to try to defeat the vampire. And Van Helsing is a very interesting character because he's a man of science, but he's also a man of religion. That's one of the messages embedded within the text, the importance of science embracing religion, and religion embracing science. But in the end, it's religion and not science that Van Helsing uses. All of the Christian symbols of cross and holy water and all of the other iconic things that we think of in terms of vampire. What we do see is that the female is corrupted, and that's perhaps one of the biggest dangers associated with the vampire, and the idea of a foreigner invading through reverse imperialism, that not only will that foreigner come and take over the economic elements of society, but also impregnate society's women and create a new race, if you will. And if you think about some of the racism experienced during the time and concerns with eugenics, you can see how frightening and threatening that idea could be. We do definitely get this question of what is life and what is death, and what happens when there is no death, if death is just a continuation of life, especially if it's an unnatural perversion of life once one transforms into death. And this is something that oftentimes is examined in horror films, because as Stephen King himself had indicated, we are fascinated with death because it is the ultimate unknown, and it's what we all have to face at one point or another. And these films perhaps give us the opportunity for, as I believe Stephen King called it, a dress rehearsal, sort of experiment with these ideas in a safe way so that we could experience a certain emotional release or catharsis. Again, this is a very European text and a very Christian text, and the film also is very European and very Christian, very Western. The idea that Christianity is the ultimate salvation from the animalistic nature that perhaps we all possess. This is something that we will see later in other films, but definitely, even in something like Dracula, one of the great fears is that Dracula is allowing individuals to engage in their animalistic desires. This idea of this never-ending hunger, which could be read literally, but could be read figuratively as well. And this incredible lust for blood, which is seen as the life force, or perhaps can even be seen as a bodily fluid that could be substituted for something like semen. And that gets us back to the idea of some of the sexual readings of the text itself. That said, it also is, outside of all of these possible interpretive meanings. It just also is a good fright story, and it was Frankenstein and Dracula that helped to lead to the 1930s universal movement of horror films, which ended towards the ending of the 1930s, where they became parodies of themselves. Things like Abbott and Costello were now fighting off some of the Universal movie monsters. But in their heyday, they were considered to be the epitome. And I think I might have mentioned, perhaps I did, maybe I didn't, that Bela Lugosi was offered the role of Frankenstein, and he didn't want to take that role of Frankenstein because, or the creature in Frankenstein, because it didn't have any dialogue. That the film Frankenstein portrays this creature, notice I say creature, not monster, portrays this creature as this inarticulate, mumbling being, and that's not the case at all in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Frankenstein is very articulate and very intelligent, and in fact the creature is the true human, I suppose, in the text, the true, and also in the film, and the monstrosity is the creator. And it's the creator's name who is Frankenstein. The creature is never given a name, which goes to show that the creator ends up negating his obligation. Not only does he violate the natural order by creating life from death, which is how the creature is created, but then once the creature is created, he's so horrified he abandons the creature. And while the Hollywood film takes some liberties, we still see how this creature is tormented by humanity purely because of its unusual appearance. And so there's all kinds of morals that happen to be embedded in that particular film. And quite honestly, as a piece of cinema, it might be even superior to Dracula. But Dracula came out first, and there is something to be said about the first. And as I indicated, Bela Lugosi did not want the role because there were no speaking parts, even though I had indicated that Lugosi prepared for Dracula by learning his roles phonetically because he didn't speak English. And the long and the short of it is that the role of Frankenstein ended up going to another iconic Hollywood actor. And then what that meant, unfortunately for Bela Lugosi, was pretty much the ending of his career. It was a very sad career where at the very ending he was just doing these these inexpensively paid appearances at local areas, dressed up in his cape, and he actually was buried in that cape. So he was forever associated with that role and typecast. And Boris Karloff was able to not only play Frankenstein, but lots of other movie monsters afterwards. Though we can never be certain if Bela Lugosi would have had the same kind of opportunity that Boris Karloff did if Bela Lugosi had accepted the role of Frankenstein. But what we do know is that for better or for worse, Dracula became Bela Lugosi's role. Bela Lugosi also suffered from drug addiction. He was one of the first actors, actually, before it became very chic for actors to admit that they were abusing and misusing drugs, to admit to that and to go into a rehabilitation clinic. So that's a little bit of information about Dracula, and what I wanted to do was to talk to you a little bit about cat people of the 1940s, and then next class we can put some closure on any odds and ends with Dracula, and then we can also talk about cat people, as well as talk a little bit more about our final project. You'll remember that I put some suggested paper topics up above in the Moodle site in the section entitled Syllabus and Other Documents, so just some ideas you could pursue. And I encourage you, now that the semester is beginning full force, for you to begin to think about possibilities of what you might want to pursue for a final project that is in one way related to horror film in media and popular culture, but you've got a lot of freedom in how to go about doing something like that, as opposed to the journals, which I'm directing, basically asking you to write a journal about each of the films. So For those of you who have already handed in a journal on Dr. Caligari, thank you very much. As you know, I had given you up until today, Wednesday's class, to hand in your journal about Dr. Caligari, because I would have put some closure onto the cabinet of Dr. Caligari last class. And the idea is that you would be handing in a journal on Dracula next week. But you can make the decision as to whether or not you feel comfortable handing it in now based on what I've said. But you've got up until the following Wednesday. And then after that, basically every Wednesday, you've got a journal due on the films that we've been covering to the previous class. So in relation to thinking about the journals, about a page or so of thoughts or observations, questions. And I'm asking that you send that to me via PDF, and I'll return that back to you so that by the ending of the semester, you'll have a good amount of commentary about all of the films. But you've also got the final project, which allows you to examine something a little bit more in depth, whether it be something that you addressed in a journal or something that was discussed in the class or something that was not discussed in the class but that you wish had been discussed in the class, that's related to the idea of horror film and media and popular culture. So our 1940s horror film is Cat People. Now, there was a 1980s remake about that, which ironically is much easier to find on the internet through a free link than for Cat People itself, which came out in 1942. But ultimately, I was able to find the link. So part of the problem is that you've got some copyright issues, and oftentimes links that exist are removed. So I'm very hopeful that this link will continue to exist at least throughout the course of the semester, since last semester's link no longer exists. That said, there are lots of different ways you can access these films. Most of them are usually available on Amazon Prime. Many of them are available on Netflix. Many of them can be rented or bought through various streaming services, but I'm going to try my best to find as many free links as I can for you as we go through the course of the semester. Obviously, if we were meeting, I would have the DVDs of these films so that we could watch them in class, so that you wouldn't be required to have to stream them. But we're in a different situation now. And then when we get to the point, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but when we get to the point where I cannot find a free link, I'll give you some other options about how to go about accessing films, whether you wanted to purchase or rent a film yourself, or if worse came to worse and that was just too much of a difficulty for you, I do have an account that I could give you an access code to. It's an awkward way of going about doing it, but it will work. So, and we'll just keep this our little secret, won't we? Because I suspect that also is a copyright violation. But it wouldn't be if we were meeting in class, because if we were meeting in class, I could stream that, and under the educational purposes law, that would be considered to be valid. So one way or another, we'll make sure that we can see all of the films over the course of the semester. And certainly if it turns out I can't find a free link and you find a free link somewhere, please send that to me, because that will help me as well as your classmates. Cat People came out in the 1940s, and the 1940s is an interesting time period, particularly because I think it was much more open to issues like sexuality and inner evil. And certainly these were issues and themes that were suggested in the 1930s and in films like Dracula, but they are much more concrete in the 1940s. Cat People also has the the honor of having the first jump scare in film. It's a beautifully shot film, very film noir, with lots. Film noir is a darkness that's used in cinematography, and it oftentimes comes from, or was inspired by, German Expressionism. Lots of shadows, lots of subtlety there, and here we will have a score. So, and that will make a difference in terms of how we interpret that particular movie. So you may not have heard of this movie in the way that you've heard of, let's say, something like Dracula, or even The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's perhaps not as iconic. But while there certainly is debate for each of the decades and what film perhaps is best representational of that decade and its fears and anxieties, most critics agree that Cat People is the, if not one of the most important horror films of the 1940s, particularly in a time period that was beginning to embrace psychology. So with that said, I hope you enjoy Cat People, and today's attendance question, which will be due on our discussion forum on Thursday, which is October 1st, hard to believe, but we've moved into October, at 6 p.m. Though, of course, if you need additional time, just let me know and I'll be happy to give it to you. What did you find to be the most surprising element of the film Cat People, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising element of the film, and why? And keep in mind that there is no right or wrong answer to this. It's just a way, hopefully, to spur dialogue. Again, read the comments from your classmates, because that'll give you, too, a good idea of some of the commentary we would have had in class. So, I hope you enjoy the film, and I hope you're well. I'm well. And next class, we'll talk about Cat People and move on. Talking about invasions, too, and body snatchers. Take care. Bye-bye.